Hi, well, thank you so much to our distinguished panel of guests. That was a fantastic and very candid discussion, and we really appreciate all of our panelists coming together to talk through this issue of balancing innovation and security. I heard some really really exciting things that we heard from the senator. The world will never go this slow again, and that is very true. And so Canada has got to innovate in order to keep up. There's really no option anymore. We've got to innovate and at least be fast followers in order to keep up with the way the world is going now with this transformation to digital that has occurred over the last 8 months. Competition is going to be increasingly necessary in order to maintain the standard of living and operation that we're used to. So I thought that was an incredibly good discussion. And then also it really seems to come down to the fact that prepaid and a lot of the sort of tangential rules and regulations around it are just not a policy option, and they haven't been a political priority in the past. And I did hear some expressions of perhaps things will be different with the new Minister of Finance who has come in, and so I guess we'll all see how that goes. But that was a great discussion and leads us very clearly into what we're going to talk about now, get a little more into the nitty-gritty of our regulatory environment in Canada. So we know that what's happening on a regulatory front determines how Canada's prepaid sector grows or lags. And so we've brought in CPPO's legal and government relations experts to give us the latest on our uncertain regulatory environment and how you can operate within it and what's maybe going to happen into the future. So I'd like to introduce our two panelists, both of whom are part of our CPPO board and members. The first is Jackie Shinfield. She is a partner in the financial services group at Blakes, Castles and Graydon LLP. She's also the co-lead of Blakes Financial Services Regulatory Group. Jackie has particular expertise in the payments industry. She's a constant speaker on the Canadian payments landscape and regulatory compliance in payments. She's been inducted into the Canadian Payments Hall of Fame, and she's regularly ranked in national and international lists as a recommended financial services regulatory lawyer. She's joined by Michael Von Herf. Michael is co-founder of PAA, Public Affairs Advisors, which is the government relations advisory group to the CPPO. And in the decades since the firm has been in business, he's built a group that works with clients to advance their public policy and regulatory agendas in Canada, the US, and Europe. In recent years, PAA has really emerged as Canada's leading government relations advisor on public policy issues affecting the financial sector, with a particular focus on the payment industry. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie and Michael. Please make sure to send them your questions. This is a great opportunity to get some free insights and thoughts from these experts. And I know they're here they want to hear what you have to say. So over to you, Jackie and Michael.
Thanks, Jen. And this is our first, I think, Jennifer-less panel of the day.
That's right. I'm going to pop off now to get rid of the Jennifers.
So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I know Jackie and I kind of conferred beforehand about what would be useful to talk about today, and Jen's done such a lovely introduction. So Jackie, I thought maybe I would start with just kind of talking about the broader political context, and then maybe you could talk a little bit more about the real substance of what's happening in the sector on the regulatory front. It seems like it's such an obvious thing, and we've heard it on every panel today, but for the public policy environment, COVID has been a game changer. This time last year, we were just finishing up a federal election. You had a minority government elected. We thought the agenda that we were all going to be looking at was about how are the Liberals going to manage a minority government. They've got a left of center agenda that wants to do some stuff in the green sector. There's sort of a pent up payments agenda that the previous panel I think did a great job of talking about the 5 or almost 5 years now since there was the first inklings of retail payments oversight, that whole initiative and the like. So that's the world we thought we were heading into in January 2020. And of course, COVID has significantly change the world in so many ways, and not least public policy. We have a public health emergency, of course, and that after the middle of March became the focus for the federal government, and it was all hands on the pump to dealing with the basics of how do we cope with the public health crisis, how do we marshal the industrial capacity of the country to fill the gaps where we don't have PPE and other vital supplies. And government really moves into an activist mode, probably the most activist since the Second World War, and particularly in a short turnaround and a short rally to get all of its capacity pointed in the same direction. Of course, the most enduring part of all of that is once they have those things lined up, it's how do we deal with the economic impact? And the way I looked at it from the first 100 days or so, I think the government took the attitude of we're going to float the economy. We're going to pump lots of money into the economy, both to individuals and businesses, that will keep us afloat, and then see where we are. And I think what we've seen is gradually a building out after that first 100 days, a kind of a ramping down, let's call it. It's left us with, in 2020, a $325 billion deficit, about 15% of GDP, and looking ahead to 2021, a $75 billion deficit projected. But the reason I'm setting that stage is, apart from that's the day-to-day reality all of us are living, for this sector, I think it's important for us to look at, okay, what's worked and what hasn't worked for government in terms of its move into the economy if we look at these financial supports, because I think it tells us what to expect next. So in terms of what didn't work or worked kind of indifferently for the government, there were a series of programs, and the senator on the last panel spoke to some of these. There were some supports that were offered for business that were more bespoke. They required some nuance. Frankly, as I reflected on it before this panel, the government, I think, in structuring its program, had a very low risk tolerance in respect of dealing with corporations, particularly corporations that aren't privately owned, where accountabilities become diffuse. So there was a large employer emergency fund that was supposed to help really distressed businesses. And the interest rates were so high and the penalties were so high that I think it has not been subscribed to by any single corporation. The rent relief for small businesses was really well, the problems with it have been really well publicized, again, because there were too many moving parts. And then there have been some co-lending initiatives for small and medium-sized businesses through BDC and EDC that are other examples of things that are kind of been a wet firecracker in terms of creating much interest. There was a wage subsidy program. Again, here, that one sort of falls into the middle. Been okay, but not a lot of enthusiasm because penalties are very high for any business that ends up applying and then ends up taking money, and then it turns out they didn't properly qualify. So it discouraged a lot of participation. But what has worked, I think, broadly speaking, has been the more broad-based, easy to qualify, easy to access, and rapidly deployable financial relief for individuals. So the CERB, for businesses, the Canadian Emergency Business Account, which was a sort of a $40,000 bridge for small businesses who qualified and whose businesses were disrupted by COVID. These have worked really well, largely because, and Ron used an expression on the last panel, Ron Morrow, go with what we know. The means of deploying it were the traditional ones, through Payments Canada, through the legacy banking infrastructure, and so on. That, there's a well-worn path there, and it was where government gravitated because they could get things done really quickly. So where I think this germane is that while that captured most people, there still was a sizable plurality of Canadians who still did not opt and Brendan spoke to this on the last panel, didn't opt to move to direct deposit. Still stuck with checks. And I think what's important as we look at the recovery phase and the government signal of intentions is direct support to individuals, to a lesser extent businesses. Direct support to individuals is here for a while. Whether it ultimately becomes a universal basic income kind of arrangement, which it sparked debate, we are going to continue to see for the medium term, I think, direct money going to Canadians who are affected and dislodged and displaced by COVID. And that, for this industry, why this matters to you, of course, is that's an opportunity. The government, as I say, there's still that ceiling of Canadians who are getting their money by check. In many cases, those beneficiaries are the ones who are in the most vulnerable communities. And the CPPO and industry, I think, in the early days of COVID, I think has done a good job with government in starting the education process around where, at the federal level, where prepaid products can fit into the mix. And that stubborn ceiling of about 10% of Canadians who don't want to enroll in direct deposit, they are a target audience for us. And what I was delighted to see, and of course it's quite timely before this conference, is last week the Receiver General put out a request for information, trying to tap the industry for information about how could we be using direct deposit, could be using prepaid more robustly to solve some of the public policy problems. And I think the industry, in the outreach that we've overtaken over the last 7-8 months, has done a really good job of starting to make the case that you don't just have to go with what you know, that there are some capabilities out there that represent innovation, but also with some of the barriers that people are experiencing because of the pandemic, in terms of access to funds, access to online shopping, sanitary issues with contactless. That prepaid represents a really important opportunity to fix the problem. And we're really encouraged that this Receiver General has decided to put a rocket under this. We're enthusiastic about industry engaging in this and providing the kind of information that can move this forward. Because, as I say, I think for the next 12 months, comfortably, and probably beyond that, we are going to see a level of traditional money directly from government to individuals like we haven't seen since the 1960s or 70s. And I think we need to be part of the mix. And as we look at some of the other regulatory issues that are on the horizon, I think driving that message of there's some untapped capabilities that the regulatory framework may be holding back, that some of the reflexes of government may be holding back, that really needs to inform the advocacy around the retail payments oversight framework, the work that is going on around payments modernization, and the engagement on open banking, of course, which was talked about previously, and we're hoping that that's a conversation that we can help to animate as we move forward in the months to come, and there's more room for the payments agenda to start to breathe again. So that's kind of at the federal level where things stand now. Jackie, maybe I can just turn it over to you to challenge everything I've said, or offer your own version of it, because I know you're a person of strong views on some of these matters.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this stuff. So everything you said is great, and the CPPO is certainly working towards getting more visibility and understanding the uses of prepaid. And that's the thing about prepaid. People think about traditional prepaid cards that are hanging on a J-hook in the store, and you go and you buy them and you put $50 on them and away you go. But prepaid is so much more. It's really, you can use prepaid as, certainly a mechanism for distributing government payments, other payments, different types of benefits. You can use it as a substitute for an account where you load it and reload it. You can use it for travel. Like the uses are endless, including, for those involved in fintech, as just a delivery mechanism as a place to store funds. So there's so much opportunity, And there's so much ability to use that because prepaid can be both a physical plastic card or can be a virtual card that's loaded in a wallet. And so the uses are endless. And so this is great for our business and it's a great opportunity. And it's awesome that the government's recommended that. But the problem is, as usual, the legislation is 10 years behind what prepaid is. So, if we go way back in the days and you talk about prepaid, we had no prepaid legislation until, from a legal perspective, fairly recently. And when the legislation did come into effect, it was really meant to address those situations where you bought sort of a gift card from a single retailer that you paid $100 for, and then you went to use it a year later and it expired. And so notably, when you're dealing with sort of a simple prepaid closed loop card, single use retailer, when those cards expire, there was a lot of consumer discontent. You read articles in the paper, we need laws. And so the Ontario government was the very first province that actually led that charge before Christmas of, I don't even remember what year it was, but they basically put out a press release and said, hey, we're going to protect you when you go buy gift cards. We're not going to allow those to expire. There's going to be no fees. And understand, this just applies to sort of retail cards. We don't mean to regulate bank cards and we don't mean to regulate telco cards. And they put that right in the press release and away we went. But of course, and other provinces followed as well, they should. But of course, the definition of prepaid card, in some provinces it's stated to be a gift card. In some provinces it's very broadly drafted to be, any type of certificate to which you can add value. And so, when you look at what prepaid card legislation was really meant to address and how it was drafted and how it could be interpreted, it could apply to much more than was originally intended. And so what happened was obviously the cost to any entity of issuing and running a prepaid program. It is very different when you're the retailer who's holding those funds and you can charge interest on those funds and you can take those charges into income, as opposed to when you're an issuer or a financial institution that's a member of a payment network where those cards come with security, they come with fraud protection, they come with loss, they are monitored. The financial institutions have obligations under anti-money laundering law. You have sanctions. Like the cost to run that program, those programs are not prohibitive, but there are significant costs involved. And so the problem we have is that the legislation that was drafted across the country provincially was really meant to deal with more of these retail cards and the open loop cards. And when we understood that perhaps class action practitioners or others would actually interpret the legislation as applying much more than was intended, there was a lot of movement towards making sure that the legislation that got passed after Ontario and other provinces was much broader and had exceptions. But it didn't quite happen that way. So what you have is you have a patchwork of provincial legislation across the country, some of which exempts banks, some of which exempts federally regulated issued cards, some of which exempts open loop cards, and some of which doesn't. And some of it depends on who the issuer is, and some of it depends on what type of card it is. And some provinces say, I don't care who you are or what you are, you can't charge anything. So like that's Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And there's some provinces that say, well, if you're a mall car, you can charge, $2.50 on issuance or up to $1.50 on issuance. And then, after 15 or 18 months, you can charge a maintenance fee. And there's nothing that's consistent. And there's no overall exemption for sort of GPR cards that people use all the time. And then after all this, a federal regime got put in place, and the federal regime is great. It only applies to federally regulated entities, and it doesn't really prohibit fees. It just says, make sure you disclose everything openly, so that the theme of those is like open disclosure. So what you now have is you have a patchwork of laws, and how they apply to your program depends on who you are, what type of program you have, and in what province you are. So trying to roll out a national effective program is a bit of a dog's breakfast. It's very difficult. And the only way to be compliant across the board is to charge nothing anywhere. Well, that might work for a retail card where the retailer can take those prepaid funds into income before the person actually uses those funds. But when you're dealing with an issuer that has all these network fees intended with the cards, because of all the cards the benefits allow for, you can use them globally all over the world, it's a totally different phenomena. And so as a result of the patchwork of legislation, there's been a few class actions that have been brought against issuers, which is unfortunate. And in those class actions, even though the legislation, specifically in Ontario and British Columbia, when the press releases were issued by the regulators, and they said these laws aren't meant to apply to banks or sort of these GPR type cards, the courts didn't pay any attention to that. They went, well, that's nice. Look at the definition. This is what it says, and this is what it means. And so it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. There has been some positive movement. We have had some changes to Ontario's laws and on changes to British Columbia laws that do provide exemptions for these types of cards to allow fees to be charged, but they're very limited. And they're limited to mostly federally regulated institutions and in some cases provincial credit unions. And the problem is, as many of you know, that these cards are now going to be issued by many more entities and not just regulated entities. So the law of who you are and what your program is completely different. Depending who you are, it's difficult to follow. The CPPO is working on this. We're trying to work with government, try to get changes made to make these cards work and be on the level playing field no matter who issues them or where they issue them. And it's difficult to do that. So that's, in an uncertainty in a regulatory environment, that would be number one. Number two would be that certainly the province of British Columbia views entities that issue prepaid cards that have ATM access as taking deposits. And then it says, no, you can't do that unless you're a deposit taking institution, which is a bit, that's their interpretation. And so again, that just causes more and more uncertainty when you have programs that have ATM access, when you don't have programs that have ATM access. And even in the British Columbia situation, that the court made that finding in circumstances where the issuer actually had funds safeguarded dollar for dollar to match the prepaid cards sitting in a trust account in a bank. They said, yeah, no, that's not good enough. Again, really difficult to try to deal in that kind of environment. Hopefully, when we talk about the retail payments framework, so when the retail payments framework does come into force, it's going to require most entities that are involved in EFTs and subject to the pillars of it to require safeguarding of funds. And hopefully, there'll be some recognition that there's a legislative regime that has safeguarding of funds, and maybe the regulators provincially will regulate that and say, no, then it's not taking deposits because you're already covered and you're secure. Again, not entirely clear. So that's, these things are the hurdles of bringing national programs across the board. And because of that, many institutions that offer these programs are exiting the prepaid space. The other reason they're exiting the prepaid space is you take that whole uncertainty of provincial regime and you top onto it AML. So as of June 1, 2021, the Proceeds of Crime Act expressly applies to prepaid cards. So it's not that it didn't apply before. If you were already a regulated financial institution, you were always required to put risk mitigation measures in place in respect of any product that you dealt with. So that meant you just couldn't, issue prepaid GPR cards and walk away. You had to put measures and controls in place. So that was great, and most entities did that. Unfortunately, the laws for prepaid are now exactly prescriptive. So it's not like, figure out the risk and put your controls in place. It's like, thou shalt do these things. And those sorts of things include that whenever someone, to keep a copy of a prepaid deposit slip effectively. So when someone's taking money to load a card, who provided it? How was it provided? Was it provided in cash? Was it provided other ways? And so when you're thinking of, different types of retail programs where people are trying to go load cards at retailers or drugstores, those record keeping requirements become very intense. So that's coupling more complexity and more cost onto a product that a lot of regulators provincially are saying you can't charge anything. So again, making an incredible product that has great great ability to be used for many things, making it difficult to use, and making it, ineffective from an economic perspective for someone to issue. That's a problem. The other thing that is not a problem, but just, again, more and more, is that the regulations dealing with the common reporting standards, the equivalent of FACTA in Canada, applies to reloadable prepaid cards. So if you're dealing with a non-Canadian who gets a reloadable prepaid card, you have to start doing your reports. So you have this environment of much regulation coming, but none of the regulation really recognizes the benefit that these cards can provide, and the importance of having a national, if you will, harmonized regime where people can issue cards, where they can be used for all kinds of things, and you don't have to worry like, oh, well, this person's in Nova Scotia, they can't do this. Oh, well, this person's in BC, we can't do this. And so, and the CPPO is working on this, but this is, in my world, this is one of the things I struggle with. You try to give clients practical advice on how to do things, and very often it's like, you can't do that. Oh, it's not clear if you can do that. And so it's causing, I think it's hurting us as a country in terms of bringing in new opportunities, new innovation, having new players come into the regime, because when I talk to foreign players and I say there's no exemptions available for you here because you're not a Canadian, financial institution, they're not going to come. Well, why would you want to put up with the class action risk, inability to charge anything? Unless you have a really type of unique program or it falls within exemptions, it's not attractive. So it's important for us to work together to make the regulatory regime harmonized and work everywhere so people can roll out these programs, and there's some benefit to that. So long way of saying there's law out there. When it was passed, no one really thought about where prepaid would go and what it would do, but because the wording is so broad, it catches everything, and that is a bit of a hindrance to carrying on a national program and all the benefits that different providers could provide. So I think I've talked for a while. I'll stop now.
It was wonderful, very, very helpful. And as I'm sure everyone recognizes, you're the substance, and I'm at the front end. So, but I want to remind everyone there are questions. There's the little Q&A chat box if people have questions. I'm going to throw a question at you though. So we had Ron Morrow from the Bank of Canada, who's overseeing the Retail Payments Oversight Framework. Maybe he's still watching. If there is one thing that you would hope that process produces that might help in that regard, is there anything that they should be looking at that you think could help bring the provinces around, or for it to be additive to that effort?
Yeah, so their framework is somewhat limited, but I think critical is that framework should have some type of recognition that anyone who is subject to that framework, first and foremost, has an obligation to safeguard funds. Whether that's through holding funds through letters of credit, holding securities to match the amounts of funds, or actually holding funds. So there will be a safeguarding requirement. So from a protection perspective, really important that sort of get disseminated to provinces so they understand that, and they don't have concerns with issuers of prepaid cards being deposit-taking institutions. They are going to be regulated in any event. There's going to be regulation of operational systems. There's going to be regulation requirement to safeguard funds. From a consumer protection perspective, there's going to be requirements to make disclosures to end users so they understand everything about the product they're using. So it's more, if the Bank of Canada can try to, when it's dealing with the provinces on market conduct, if it kind of get the message across like, hey, we're doing a lot here that you don't have, and so maybe we can lighten up in these other ways when you're regulating a product like prepaid, a way of example. So yeah, that would be awesome. Okay. If that message could go, if you're watching, that'd be awesome.
And to fintechs that they're tuning in, and what should they be thinking about? What do you think they should be doing in order to move this subject forward in a way that's going to be good for everyone?
Well, so certainly come and engage with the CPPO, because that's what we're doing, and we're an organization that's here to help you with that. And I'm, if you can't tell, I'm really passionate about this. Like, I want everyone to come here and carry on business and be successful. It's great for us. It's great for our economy. It's great for businesses. So the problem is you have this legislation that can be hindering. So, the first thing is to try to work on products that have a different sort of underlying cost base, where you can have a product that works depending what you use it for. Come and get engaged, and be part of the solution here. But I guess if you're coming here from another jurisdiction, it would be, you have to try to come with a program that's going to work for what you're doing. And before you sort of start getting everything going, make sure that your prepaid program or what you're trying to do with prepaid will work from a regulatory perspective, or at least allow you to recover costs. So by way of example, if you have a corporate type of program where you can't impose costs on the end user, you could likely impose those costs on your corporate partner. So there's other ways of structuring things. You just have to be creative and make sure you're not doing anything to bring yourself in the eyes of class action lawyers, because this has been as of recent, a sexy class action area.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I guess we're down to our last 90 seconds, I think, here. The only thing I would add as well, just in terms of orientation in this time, and working on some of these areas where we're trying to play in the space of being a delivery mechanism for government support. One of the reasons why I think, apart from convenience, that government went to the traditional legacy infrastructure to deliver some of these support programs is that I think industry didn't do a good enough job of explaining why they were a solution to a problem. There tended to be very self-serving approaches. I'm saying this across the financial sector. I'm glad with CPPO, we kind of stuck with a program to try to explain to government how we would be helping to solve a public interest issue, and that has to do with the underbanked and unbanked. And I think we're making a dent in the issue, shall we say? But there's still a little way to go, as you've highlighted. So, Jen, I'll turn it over to you. I don't know, Jackie, if there are any concluding remarks.
No, I mean, I've sort of, I said what I had to say, and hopefully we'll have success moving forward and getting a harmonized system across the country.
Great. So we're back to our regular schedule of Jennifer's. And I think we're at 12:55. So I hope that was useful.
Thank you. You guys win the award for punctuality today. You finished right on time. Jackie and Michael, thank you so much for that very quick run through. If it isn't obvious to all of the panelists, these two have incredible expertise in this area, and the CPPO is very grateful to have them on board. And I will just conclude with what Jackie was saying. If this is of interest to you, if this is the kind of information that helps your company, if you can benefit from the work that we're doing, you need to join the CPPO. So please email me at info@cppo.ca. We have multiple member levels, including those for emerging companies, and we really all need to work together. As we heard in the panel prior, we have a lot of work to be done here on the policy side, the political side. We just need all boats rowing in the same direction. So please join us so that we can all make a difference together and ensure that this industry grows and flourishes in a responsible and exceptional way for all of you in the industry.